Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Nicole Myers, the Barbara Thomas Lemon Senior Curator of European Art, and I'm excited to welcome you to our annual Rosenberg Fête. Of course, things are a bit different this year. We unfortunately aren't able to celebrate the art of 18th century France with an evening of art, food, and music at the DMA as we normally do. That said, we're thrilled that we're still able to deliver the highlight of the evening, the Rosenberg Lecture, straight to you in the comfort of your home. In fact, there's one silver lining to our present unusual circumstance, and it's that this virtual presentation has allowed us to cast our net a little further afield in selecting tonight's speaker, who is joining us from Australia. Before I introduce him, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the trustees of the Michael L. Rosenberg Foundation, Larry Barzoon, Debo Gage, and Bob Harrison, for their sustained support of the DMA through its long-term loan of the Rosenberg collection, as well as this important lecture series. I'm sure they're with us tonight watching remotely, and to them we extend our sincere gratitude and ardent wish that next year we'll be together again. I encourage you all to visit the dedicated Rosenberg Gallery at the DMA. The museum, as I hope you know, is open and can be visited by reserving your free timed ticket on our website. You can also explore the collection online by visiting the virtual tour that we created that allows you to walk through all of the European galleries and read, listen, and watch content that we've put together for you all on our website. Tonight's esteemed speaker is Professor Mark Ledberry, Power Professor of Art History and Visual Culture at the University of Sydney and Director of the Power Institute. His specialty is 18th century French and British painting, and he's the author of numerous publications, including 𝐸𝐴DIN, 𝐶𝐸𝐻, and the Boundaries of Genre, and James Northcote, History Painting and the Fables. Professor Ledberry's research and writing often focus on histories of genre, theater, and the visual arts in 18th and 19th century. He took his degrees at the University of Cambridge and the University of Sussex, and his first academic post was as lecturer in cultural history at the University of Portsmouth. He then taught art history at the University of Manchester until 2003, when he joined the Clark Art Institute in Massachusetts as the Associate Director of the Research and Academic Program. There, he oversaw the expansion of the program's ambition and reach. He planned and implemented workshops, conferences, and partnerships, and worked to develop and oversee a prestigious residential scholars program. At the Power Institute, he's been director or co-director of large grant initiatives, including 2 supported by the Getty Foundation. In this role, he ensures that the Power Institute furthers its research and public engagement mission through talks, conferences, and the support of research and publications that seek to enlarge and expand the global scope of art history. Tonight's talk, titled "What's the Story? Imagination, Emulation, and Risk in History Painting," will take Jacques-Louis David's Apollo and Diana Attacking the Children of Niobe, which was acquired by the DMA in 2008, as its point of departure. Mark will discuss how artists chose their subjects, what literature they read, and the role played by critics, advisors, peers, and friends in their choices of narrative and treatment of the subject. Such questions will help us explore and understand with fresh insight some of the most striking and bizarre history paintings of 18th century France. Following Mark's lecture, we'll host a live Q&A session, so please post your questions in the video chat throughout the talk, and we'll join you after the lecture to answer. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mark Ledberry to the virtual podium.
Hello and good evening, everybody. My name's Mark Ledberry, and I'm absolutely delighted to be with you in this somewhat strange format to give a lecture in the Michael L. Rosenberg Lecture Series. And I would first like to express my thanks to Julien Domat, to Jesse Carrillo, to all the team at the Dallas Museum of Art who are helping me both by the invite, by encouraging me, by discussing the subject, but also, of course, with the technical matter. And I'm absolutely delighted to be part of such a long and distinguished lineup of lecturers. I hope that this strange format, which is no substitute for a real talk in real life, but will be adequate, and I hope that this talk will contain enough to keep you with this small box in the bottom of your screen. My topic today might strike you as a bit dry or even academic, And that's a slightly pejorative word these days, but of course, if we think of the academies not as the sort of dusty gatherings of Renaissance antiquarians, or worse, authoritarian creations of Louis XIV and sort of heavy-handed arts policy, but instead see them as sort of repositories of the bizarre brilliance of generations of painters and sculptors and printmakers, thinkers, architects, historians and scientists, they then might represent something like pools of creativity and innovation, communities of friendship, sometimes enmity, of course, rivalry, humour, ambition, spaces of risk-taking. That's how I'd like to see the academies. And in a way, we must remember that from this slide, this is a slide designed to show you that there are two things at once. Academies across Europe, particularly in the French model, were both art schools seething with often young male learning talent, and the dusty repositories of discussion and debate. Not so dusty really, but lively and hierarchical organizations to which the young person must aspire via a series of steps. Academies are both these things. They are contemporary art schools, and they are the places where the intellectual frameworks of the arts get made. And that's an interesting and tense duality. The privileged genre of the academies, as I think we know, is something called history painting, which again has been seen by sort of modern eyes as somehow always hyperbolic or stilted or slightly superannuated, a sort of grande machine from which modernity sort of successfully liberated itself in its new forms. And I mean, this is really a slightly absurd slide to show you that, in a way, the great sort of passions of history painting for subjects, whether it be the death of Seneca in Noël Hellè's version here in Boston, is in a way replaced by two versions of figure painting in modernity, one of which focuses on the life, the habits, and the sort of focus of ordinary people in ordinary actions. And of course, Cézanne and others take that very far in the 1890s, but also a sort of universalizing model of human psychology, where the figure is, if you like, its representation of everyone is through the psychic expression of the agony of a time, but it is anonymous. It is not hitched to a particular subject. History painting then has a sort of reputation for something against which one rebels, rather than in itself charged with excitement and tension and if you like, complexity and a sort of gripping visceralness. I think that's the last thing we'd probably say about history painting. And yet, I would argue, that's precisely what history painting is, a visceral genre, a genre in constant experiment, a genre in constant flux, which no one really knows what it is, always escaping, always a fantasy, part of the aspiration of painters, but also their undoing. And also capable of extraordinary complexity in itself. So, I mean, obviously, we have here three, I think, of the great history paintings in the European tradition of the 17th and 18th century. Philippe de Champaign's astonishing, contemplative, confronting Dead Christ, David Lichter's bringing to Brutus the voice of his dead sons, of which more later, and Henry Fuseli's confounding and extraordinary The Nightmare, from 1781. I mean, all part of, I think, a history of history painting that we need to slightly decenter, or at least see through new eyes. Too often, I think, we sort of have a model of history painting in our head, which is, in essentially this painting, perhaps, Poussin's Arcadian Shepherds, which, as we know, has been interpreted and reinterpreted throughout the centuries, but which, in a way, is readable, as the great Panofsky read in 1936, is text-based. Somehow its meaning emerges through our confrontation with the text, and sort of erudite and well-behaved. We are like the shepherds themselves, interpreting, trying to work out what it says. I think maybe, although there's an admirable aim, we might want to look a little beyond a kind of, a sort of textual meaning-based version of history painting to a more flesh and blood history. And such a flesh and blood history, of course, would be a complex history of the strange reception and misunderstanding and dispersion of Poussin's paintings from the amazing 18th century misinterpretations of the painting through binocles in Arcadia, through digital renditions of the painting. In other words, I think we should see history painting in its replete reception, its long-term reception, and also in the way that it is taken against itself. And one of the reasons I'm talking to you tonight is because that has been my excitement over the last few years to create such a sort of outside-in or eccentric version of history painting. It might surprise people to know that history painting theory, we always imagine there was reams of theory backing up what history painting is. Actually, it's a rather under-theorized genre. But one thing that all art history students, 101 students, always learn is that in the Ancien Régime, in France, there was a hierarchy of genres, and that in fact, 𝐕𝐤𝐫𝐤, in his famous sort of preface to a printing up of some of the academic lectures that happened in the early academy, stated that there was a hierarchy of painting, and it went from still life at the bottom right up to history painting at the top. Well, that's true, and it isn't true in the sense that we know that 𝐕𝐤𝐫𝐤 did create a hierarchy, but a hierarchy of painters. He was establishing the idea of a painter's path to the greatness of a painter, that in fact you had to start, if you're a painter of still life, you're pretty good. If you're a painter of landscapes, you take more, then animals, but then of course humans as the greatest creation of God on earth are the privileged subject of a painter. But portraits aren't enough. You need to put figures together. A painter who must move from painting a single figure to several together, must treat history and fable. He must paint grand actions like a historian or pleasant subjects like the poet. We will notice that this is actually about painters. It's a flesh and blood. It's a desire for a perfect painter, but it's based on sort of lots of hierarchies, but it's also a capacious definition. It's a definition that includes all the people who took on subject painting from the most pleasant. There's no sense that it must be a serious subject or that it even must be a religious subject to be at the top of the hierarchy. The real top of the hierarchy for 𝐕𝐤𝐫𝐤 is allegory, the ability to create, sort of veil the greatest mysteries and sort of reveal them subtly. And in a way, we sometimes forget this, but I would just want to emphasize here, and allegory is a whole other ballgame, but I would like to emphasize here the sense that this is a capacious definition that would allow for lots of different practice and doesn't nail down one kind of painter or one kind of painting. And furthermore, when we hear, we know about these academic debates, the conférences as they're known, or lectures, which brought the artists together, the senior artists together to talk about paintings and their ideas about them. But I would like to refocus on those as kind of real flesh and blood encounters between great painters at the top of their games. Le Brun here, Champagne there, and their famous argument about Poussin's Eliezer and Rebecca at the well is it's gone down in sort of the annals of academic history because there's Champagne saying, where are the camels? And because in the text, this is a desert scene, he came on a camel, why isn't there a camel? Le Brun says, well, ridiculous, why would we have a camel in? That's debased things. And of course, it gets at some very serious and philosophical and theological issues, but it is also a spirited butting of heads of two great painters. And of course, in the slightly dusty minutes, we only see traces of this. We see it sort of repressed, but we have to see the Academy as a real living centre of ideas and debate and discussion, which rumble through the century, not a settled, coherent body of theory. And of course, when we are talking about history painting, we are also talking about, not about the past, but about contemporary practice. And of course, in the 18th century, we're increasingly talk about contemporary practice that is exhibited, that is compared and contrasted by an active public and critical sphere, which delights in strange encounters, in misreading, in not understanding the subject, or in deliberately, in Diderot's case, misreading and misrepresenting subjects in order to get at larger points. In other words, that history painting does, especially as the exhibitions develop in the 18th century, bursts out of its academic frame and becomes a full part of the kind of furious and interesting and contradictory and humorous discourse that marks the public sphere in other areas in France, particularly the theatre, but also in the print sphere and in the debates that make of the 18th century in Paris a philosophical and intellectual melting pot. And this is a glorious rendition of some of the sort of the extraordinary richness and intense experience of the Salon as portrayed by Gabriel de Saint-Aubin. So then what was history painting, you might argue? Well, I'm showing you what I believe to be one of the very greatest history paintings of the 18th century, and you may be surprised to hear me say that. But think about Felibien's capacious hierarchy, as it says that a great history painter must be able to conquer still lives, things inanimate, maybe that's rocks, or flowers and vegetables, or seascapes and landscapes. It must then move to animals, and then higher still to portraits of the human or to human figures, and then to the greatest mysteries and the gods and allegory. It seems like Boucher does all of that in such a glorious sweep in this painting, as well as engage profoundly with that poetic and indeed difficult subject of Ovid's Metamorphoses, as, of course, this is the prelude to a terrible abduction and rape in which the bull, Jupiter is disguised as the bull, will indeed transport and ravish Europa. But at this stage, the text of Ovid is remarkably sort of comic in its description of the bull and its slavering eyes, and Boucher has rendered this fantastically, as well as demonstrate a kind of overall coherence of vision, and even an emulation of his great precedents in Titian, etc. So in a sense, if one was looking for great examples of history painting in the century, this might surprisingly be that thing, rather than perhaps the Poussin or the David that we normally imagine in history painting. We might say, though, this looks more typically a history painting. There you are. It clearly seems to represent a sort of, there's a palace, there's somebody is in the throes of some kind of virtuous death. But in fact, this painting, Jean-Baptiste Marie Pierre's The Death of Harmonia, again, probably not so familiar to many of you, but in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and its print from 1751, when it was displayed after it by Cauchin, is on the right, is a really interesting example. We expect of history painting that it's morally clear, that it's unambiguous, but who is this Harmonia? Do we all know about the particular story, this strange story, poor old Guénon of Syracuse, who is a tyrannical and appalling king, and finally he's rebelled against, but his family is all in mortal danger from the mob. And Harmonia has a great idea, or the family have this great idea: we're going to save you by taking your enslaved servant, dressing her up in your clothes so she gets killed and you can flee, which of course is a morally ambiguous idea in the first place. However, Harmonia herself, when she is witness to the keenness and eagerness of her enslaved servant to die for her, she decides that she will die too, and she will stay and face the murderous mob. The trouble is, again, we see that actually, first of all, it's not a well-known subject. So people who faced this painting in the Salon probably didn't actually know what was really going on, and it's only in the print where you can actually describe the story that some attempt at explication is known. But even then, it's morally unclear. It's the Syracuse regime against which he's rebelled is a terrible one. Are we to see these furious rebels as a murderous mob, or those seeking justice? Are we to see Harmonia as as a kind of one of great privilege and power trying to escape from justice, or the terrible victim of an appalling violent attack? In a way, even when we see a history painting whose rhetoric we think we understand as history painting, we often find in the 18th century a moral ambiguity, a strangeness, even a kind of relish of the kind of violence rather than the moral message that I think is very evident in this Pierre painting. But for the rest of my talk, I want to sort of track some specific examples of kind of the human history of history painting. The history of painting as a human struggle, as a struggle both as from the contemporary art student's point of view and the hierarchical academy point of view, the history of failure, of tension, of strangeness in a human way, as part of the kind of more flesh and blood history painting history that I'd like to trace. And of course, I'm going to start with this painting in your own collections at Dallas. Jacques-Louis David's Apollo and Diana attacking with arrows the children of Niobe, as it's known. And of course, this is not the triumphant David of the 1780s or the furious and politically committed David of the 1790s. This is the suffering student, the underperforming student David of the 1770s. Remember, Jacques-Louis David, from artisan stock, lost his father early, came to Paris through his entrepreneur building trade contacts, is a talented draftsman and aspiring artist, has great ambitions, joins the academy school, aspires to the competition. In 1771, he fails at his first attempt, and his great rivals among the cohort he's with, especially Suvet, Jean-Benoît Suvet, for whom he retains a lifelong loathing, get ahead of him. And this is his second attempt at the Grand Prix in 1772. And again, I want to plunge us back into the sort of the young rivalrous history of history painting as a living practice, because of course David produced this under particular conditions. Those admitted to compete for the Rome Prize, which is the greatest prize for the young painter, it means you will go to the Académie de France à Rome for a 4-year-ish stint, which is supposed to mint you as a painter and to finish you and to give you an understanding of the greatness of the classics and of the Renaissance and blood you as a painter. And it's the great aspiration. It's the sign of success. The stakes are very high then. But what happens is they all get called into a room, the painters who are allowed to compete. There's maybe 6 or 7 of them, sometimes 5, and they are given a subject on the spot to which they have to sketch. And then they can, if that sketch is approved, if they seem to have understood, then they're allowed to go into special boxes and produce a painting, again under time pressure, and again sort of thinking quickly. And this is what was confronted David and his rivals in 1772, the story of Niobe, a terrible story really, from Ovid's Metamorphoses, in which the great and vain Niobe, with her children, 14 in some accounts, 7 daughters, 7 sons, other accounts give others, is sort of vainglorious and rivalrous with Latona, saying, look at me, you've only got 2 children, look at my impressive stable of children and look at me, and I want the people to look at me and worship me. Why are they continuing to worship you? And of course, this angers Latona and her offspring, Apollo and Diana, and they come with horrible vengeance and horrible swiftness to kill in a hail of arrows first the 7 sons and then the 7 daughters of Niobe. She tries not to plead and stay as stoic as possible in the face of this, but she watches her husband commit suicide. She watches every single one of her children die, and is finally transformed in such grief into a rock formation, which you can still see on a mountain in Greece. And this is an appalling story, really. It's a story, however, that has caught poetic imaginations right up to Ted Hughes, and in his Tales from Ovid, who chooses to retell this as it's a bloody tale, it's a revenge story, it's an appalling it has an appalling kind of unrelenting violence to it, which is so absolute. It tells of the dangers of vanity and luxury in some ways, but it also tells of the implacable energies of the gods when they are crossed. And why was it set? Well, one could make lots of arguments, but I think partly it was because the worthies of the Academy at the time, interestingly, would have known of the currency of discussions of the famous Niobe group, or a group of statues discovered centuries before, but then sort of laid out in an interesting way in the gardens of the Villa Medici in Rome, which was not then the French Academy, remember, at this point, but they were seen as an exemplary and interesting group of sculptures. There are complicated accounts of which statues actually really belong to this story or not, but basically Winckelmann and others had made this statue group extremely famous among the young generations, the excited generation of antiquarians and scholars and artists in the 1760s, and his History of Ancient Art had praised this group particularly, as had other accounts. And of course, Perrier had made some famous etchings, engravings after the statues, and so the group had currency, and particularly because in the early 70s it was taken away, it was absent from Rome and gone to Livorno for restoration. And of course, that's a long story which ends in now. It's of course in the famous Niobe room in the Uffizi, and where you can see this image on the left, and that. In other words, I think the students were being encouraged to a kind of paragone, not just to rivalness with themselves for this subject, but also this idea that painting, what could a painter do to create a sort of a panorama like this astonishing ancient sculptural group? What could painting rival sculpture in this matter? So David tells us, and we know this from an autobiographical fragment, which I'll show you in a minute, but he clearly was, I think, inspired by a knowledge of the kind of the complex system of groupings in that group, as well as his own reading of Ovid, and particularly the fact that Ovid gives us sort of separate moments in this narrative. First, the slaying of the boys and the sons, who were all involved in athletic and military exercises, in other words, full of their own prowess, completely powerless against Apollo's arrows, who mercilessly slays them. This is followed then by a sort of weeping and a general weeping of the daughters themselves, and this is at that point that Diana starts to slay the daughters with her arrows. And it is a furious scene, but it is also one that takes place over a chronologically separate incident, and the painter has to do something about it. How can that be compacted? And of course, David he wants to show us how from the horses stamping and the boy who's shot on a horse and clings dead to the horse, to the boy that takes the arrow out of his own body and then has another one shot into him. These terrible aspects. I think David really wanted to try to sort of give us a whole sense of the unfolding of this narrative. He certainly took it very seriously, and was enthused by the subject. Others in the competition, particularly the brilliant winner of the competition, Pierre Jambert, an exact contemporary of David's, and also his friend, decided on a different strategy, a different format, a more vertical format, showing, if you like, the godly realm more clearly, but also to focus very much on Niobe sheltering her daughter in a more deliberate echo of the sculptural group. Of course, he doesn't shrink either from the violence of the arrows raining down. Indeed, that arrow fired almost off stage by, we are to assume the last fleeing daughter is shot. There is no escape even beyond the frame for Jambert. It's striking, but you can see that, these are both artists under pressure. They are told to produce a version, and this is how it affected a different kind of painterly intellect. By the way, this is his beautiful paper sketch, oil on paper sketch, and this is on the right is, of course, his final painting. Yet another artist and rival, Charles-Gabriel Lemonnier chose, let us call it, a more Baroque operatic staging, where sfumato allows us to cover some of the more appalling of the, or at least billowing clouds, and a sense of vagueness envelops the principal scene, and in which Niobe is not particularly supporting or sheltering any of the daughters, but herself bending and bowing before the onslaught in a way that really doesn't entirely match Ovid, but which of course would have been reminiscent of a kind of the dramas of many epic and epic-derived operas. In this rather moving account of his own experiences, David penned a decade or so later, he describes how Ovid m'avait tellement monté la tête. Ovid had got so much into my head. I love this idea that, again, it's a sort of frantic attempt to encapsulate the tale. It's a sort of battle with Ovid's brilliance that produces in David the need to try to get as many things in. And what happens is, and what's really interesting, is that he himself admits that his painting bears the marks of sort of badly mixed colour, because he kept overpainting and painting again and not quite hitting it, so that what started as what he thought was a great painting discoloured and was badly affected, or at least that's the story he tells. But what I'm most interested in was that he sort of was burnt in his brain, the subject. He was sort of exalted as he took on Ovid, and that's a really interesting part. Texts make people, they're not dry, dusty things. They're things that enliven and fire the imagination, properly poetically. But also, if you read the last of these paragraphs, he is describing how Jambert was his friend, and that he had advised Jambert on his own painting, and that, in a way, he felt it was a great injustice that he then missed out. You could read this at your leisure, I hope. And sadly, David came off worst in this, and by a rather unfortunate series of events. He loses out to Jambert, whose painting is absolutely fantastic, I think, but he also loses out to Lemonnier, and this is a great surprise to him, and unfortunately for him, his exalted state soon turns into a depressive one. He goes into his room, he determines to lock himself away, and it is only his friends and his mentors, Sedaine and Doyen, who pull him out of that. And of course, Niobe marks him as a failure, and he's only able to pull himself out of that 2 years later. And it's this painting, the Antiochus and Stratonici, which finally wins David the Rome Prize 2 years later, and sets him off on his path to Rome. The Niobe then is witness to the complex, intense first stage of the aspiring history painter's career, rivaling with in a specific subject against one's companions, fighting for the podium of the Rome Prize. But for painters who achieved success, even though it's early success, there were other hurdles to academic recognition, in the sense that the academy was a structure with rigid hierarchies. You had to present a morceau d'agrément, which would be your passport to being able to exhibit with the academy, a kind of associate membership. And then finally, your morceau de réception, which would be the piece you would present, like in the old days, a guild masterpiece, in order to be accepted fully into the academy. And you would again face your judges in a different way as a more mature painter, asking for full acceptance. Often would happen in the 10 years that might follow your successful winning of a prize. It could happen in different ways, but and of course, I've stopped myself on perhaps the most famous sort of disaster of a reception piece ever presented in the history of French history painting, and that's Greuze's Septimia Severus and Caracalla, which is currently in the Louvre, which is one of a painting I have lived with since I was a graduate student, and which is endlessly and consistently fascinating, and which must take an important place in any history of history painting, both as a kind of flesh and blood thing, but also as a kind of as a genre that doesn't know quite what it is, or where decisions about what a history painting is are made by communities, not according to theoretical rules. So we will know that. So I'll take you a little through the story of this briefly, if I can, though I tend not to be that brief, through the story of this painting. Greuze was, of course, a sort of celebrated painter from his surprising and astonishing debut in the Salon of 1755. He sort of came from nowhere. He was a slightly contrary Academy pupil who wasn't particularly well liked, but he produced a rather stunning painting, The Family Bible Reading, which was sort of received so warmly both by kind of an academy that was desperate to sort of co-opt new talent, but also a critical sphere that felt that it was seeing new pictures of a kind of bourgeois virtue that it really liked the look of. And of course, one might think of Diderot and others creating dramas at the same time, which presented for the first time on stage kind of a virtuous patriarchal village life in a serious mode. Greuze played on this reputation for a good many years and had a fantastic run. This included the astonishing success of The Marriage Contract in 1761, lauded not only by those academic patrons that had supported Greuze, but also by the critical sphere, and The Paralytic in 1763. These grand narratives their structures very much derived from the pyramidal composition and the multi-figure fluency that history painters were supposed to have, but creating a sort of new kind of noble elegance for a setting for sort of bourgeois patriarchy, if you want to call it such a thing, and thus providing a new fantasy image for a group of spectators who were very delighted to receive this image and to contrast it with the luxury and the corruption of court interiors. But how did we get here? Well, in 1765, Greuze began to, it seems, meditate on a historical subject, frustrated with the sense of his own talent being contained within what was seen as inferior genres, or not as fully accomplished as the great universal painting that belonged to the history painter. Greuze determined that he would set about being a history painter, it seems. But he chose not a subject, again, from the sort of morally clear end of the spectrum, or from the most famous reaches of the Plutarch stories or the repertoire of ancient history, but from the rather dirty empire end of Roman history, from the Roman Emperor Septimus Severus, who, of course, is a great military man of North African descent, who ascends to the empire and goes to quell, among other places, violently the rebellions of North Britain. He goes to patrol Hadrian's Wall, he goes to attack the North Britons, he tries to quell rebellions, and in bringing his son Caracalla with him, he's returning to base at York, and he is the subject of what looks like an assassination attempt by his own son, Caracalla. So later that evening, the gouty, and he was suffering from gout, Septimius, brings his son in and says, "So, I hear you try to kill me. Well, look, here's my sword. I'm an old man, I'm lame. Why don't you just run me through now?" According to and in fact, this is part of the title of the painting, in its long salon title at least. And very few people knew this story. It was known to the more scholarly readers of Roman history, but it was very little precedented. In fact, I almost go to say unprecedented. Strange choice of subject for someone trying to make a great leap to the history painter. But it's not just that, of course. It's a strange old painting altogether. It represents, in many ways, it represents its own dilemma in some ways. There's Caracalla, having failed, standing against his worthies and betters and older and more experienced, both his father and the advisors, Papinian and Castor, who ranged against him. He is sort of both shamefaced and failed, and he can't do the deed. And it's a strangely, one might even be tempted to say autobiographical painting, in the sense that if you see Greuze there facing the Academy in 1769, trying to be elected fully, having failed to do the deed and being sort of reprimanded. But it works by some strange means. It obviously echoes or deliberately tries to take Poussin on in some of his volumes, the use of very erudite use of architecture by its contrast of the sort of internal domestic architecture with large-scale interiors. It feels a bit like some of the Poussin's Death of Germanicus and other things, but it also peculiarly integrates Greuze's former sort of love of the sort of simpering teenager and the guilty or cruel teasing younger brother, or the the skulking teenager. And it is a very surprising void to try to cross, if you like, between that register and this. And if this seems a bit improbable, let's look at the sketch that he made, or that is now in Tournu, for this painting. So clearly here, one of the key idea is here already, and you can see even more the sense of the sort of sulky teenager, or and the sort of domesticity of it all, or at least where that domesticity might have emerged from. But of course, in this sketch, the dagger is a dagger, and it is pointed towards Septimius, rather than right towards the sun, in a sort of very powerful way, as we see in the completed painting. In this complete version, obviously the stretching out of the scene, but is also accompanied by the elongation of that sword and its pointing towards Caracalla. The sort of, it is hard not to see this as a sort of failed Oedipal moment. He has failed to kill the father, and now the father, with his overextended limbs and his giant hand and his big sword, is taking a kind of revenge. And Caracalla himself, of course, would become the killer of both. He tried to kill his father, and then later on he will kill his own brother, he will kill Perpignan, he will kill Castor, and he will have many others killed. It's a sort of, it's a moment that every part of it reeks of a kind of violence and failure, without it being a violent and failed image. It's a strange and perplexing one. It continues to fascinate me, but it is also vital, because it was the moment where we lost a great history painter of the future, because Greuze was so humiliated by the Academy saying, we're looking at this, we're going to give you your reception, but only as a genre painter. And we are therefore going to pretend that this painting doesn't really exist, and we're going to imagine that you came here with a different reception piece and you're a genre painter. A very strange academic decision, which plunges Greuze into a fury and an embarrassment that leads him to not exhibit with the Academy for the rest of the Ancien Régime. And we lose a great history painter to be, probably, and the history painting has lost a lot of great figures, including, of course, I would argue, the great rival of Greuze, Fragonard, because, of course, Jean-Noël Fragonard himself had burst into the scene with this most extraordinary Rubensian kind of painting, the 𝐶𝐭'𝐬 and 𝐶𝐭'𝐬, in 1765. But he too, after such an extraordinary showing in the mid-60s, leaves the academic scene in the late 1760s, slightly disgruntled by never having been paid or been given the full due care and attention. He, the sort of, if you like, the Rubens of France, as Mercier said, we lost the Rubens of France. He leaves the history painting path too. So we lose, by between 1765 and 1769, two of the great painters of their generation are completely taken off the path of history painting. And that's another part of the history of history painting that I really want to explore. How many does it reject? How much does it lead to failure and disgruntlement? I'm conscious of rather overimposing on my time with you, but I want to also talk about, after the reception piece, I want to talk about sort of how a painter flourishes in the public sphere, or doesn't. And this will be the final section of my talk tonight. And again, I'll begin with a painting that may not be familiar. This is François-Guillaume Menajot, another of David's rivals, and this is his painting that he exhibits on as a sort of great first statement of his talent after Rome as a sort of exhibiting senior artist, or aspiring senior artist. It's the Leonardo da Vinci dying in the arms of François Ier, and it's in Amboise now, I remember seeing it in a more obscure location in the Loire Valley when I was a grad student. It is an extraordinary painting, and definitely the outright winner of the public opinion battle in 1781. People celebrated its glorious attention to both antiquizing detail and medievalizing detail, or pageant detail. The page boys were loved by everyone, and also it's a fantasy, a history painter's fantasy of what it's like to be an important painter and have a king pay filial homage to the greatness of a senior artist. In a way, it puts the artist at the center of everything. It's a fantasy of what patronage might look like under the new regime of Dangeville and others. It was a great success, but 𝐵𝐚𝐲's life was complex afterwards, partly for reasons that I might have time to explain in a few minutes. But we've got to remember that this is perhaps what history painting might have looked like, absent the presence of David. This detail just gives some sense of the actual, some of the great qualities of 𝐵𝐚𝐲 and why its costuming appealed so much to the crowds at the time. Meanwhile, in another part of the salon, in his corner, a darker, more complex, more broken, more, let's call it more intense vision of what it might be like to be the subject of an empire or an unjust regime emerged, with David picking up not on, if you like, the fantasy of painters and the crown, but picking up on popular literature, on new dramatic currents, and on all kinds of other, if you like, aspects of the public sphere at the time to generate new kinds of if you like, extreme and use of the void and clarity of figures. This isn't a crowded scene. These are monumental figures in monumental surroundings. And David seems to have learned, in a way, from some of what he lost to in 1772 with Joubert, but also learning from his great friends and as I think I have written before, his friends in the dramatic scene and in those who could advise him on literature and on. He's trying other tactics to get at, rather than painterly ones, dramatic ones drawn from the great operas of Gluck or the dramas, the new dramas of Debussy and Cézanne, to try to break through and make his reputation against a generation slightly older than him, like 𝐵𝐚𝐲, to an extent like Suze and Pierre, who were a little ahead of him. He has to choose new tactics, and that's another part of the history of history painting, the history of spectacle, the history of engineered spectacle, sudden arrivals, bursting into scenes, the use of space, the use of the dimensions of a canvas, the use of verticality, all to to individuate oneself. David's Belisarius was described by some critics as trop noir, and in a way he took that to heart after 1781. He went about in a very studied way a kind of self-discipline or repression. We know this because in 1783 his reception piece was this extremely well-behaved, thoughtful, epic, beautifully designed painting, which people tend to think of as the dull one in the Davidian sequence of the 1780s, but in fact its restraint tells its own story. The fact that he has boiled down the grand epic histories of the Trojan War to subtle indications of both, the departure of Hector and the death of Hector in the sarcophagal frieze, and has instead brought a concentration and a focus on a kind of an appalling domestic moment, in which no less than Niobe, Andromaque is aware of the futility of the terrible fate that must await her and Astyanax after the death of Hector. It is a self-disciplined painting in some ways, although dark. And we see that self-discipline. Well, what we don't see is the amazing, furious collection of subjects that David was thinking about between 1781 and 83, which I discovered when I came across this set of notes in the archives, which clearly are a series of subjects. This is David's hand, and he's writing a collection of subjects which might be suitable for painting, which will of course include les Trois Horaces, which we will see come back later in 1785, but also remarkably, this is a man preparing his reception piece, remarkably include 4 or 5 subjects drawn from the very story of Septimius Severus and Caracalla that had landed Greuze in so much trouble only a little bit over a decade before. It's almost as if David's cussed side, his elated side, his challenging side, wanted to say, well, I'm going to make a go of it. I'm going to make the Septimius painting that works for my reception piece. And indeed, we know that he tried. To me, this sheet of notes is a very moving testimony to a kind of, he's reading all these pot boilers, the lives of the empresses. This is not even an orthodox history that he's reading. He's reading the sort of, scandal sheet history of the late Roman Empire to sort of stir him up. And we know remarkably that he made many sketches towards subjects from the Septimius and Caracalla as a violent appearance of ghosts and things that would have been absolute anathema, I think, to the Academy had he presented them. It's quite remarkable that he got so far down the line of a subject, the cursed subject of Septimius Severus and Caracalla. So I think the history of Caracalla that was never told by David is also the history of David measuring risk and risk-taking and entrepreneurship as part of the history of history painting that I'd like to come back to really just for the last couple of minutes of this talk. I won't talk greatly about the Oath of Horatio because so many people have spoken about it so much and it's become so exemplary. But I would just point out that the whole trappings around it, going over back to Rome to sort of create the painting in a kind of semi-secret, semi-gossip way, coming back with a slightly too big painting, dominating the salon in a particular way by using the very voids and structures, knowing in a way how the display of the painting might pitch it into a kind of centrality. And that was a big risk for David, a risk. It was by no means a success before it happened. And in a way, I think we have to remember it's because this has become such a sort of emblematic painting. I think we have to remember how exciting and how risk-taking it was at the time to use the voids in the way he had, to sort of break some rules of perspective in order to sort of account for the fact that people will probably be looking at it from below, slightly tipped down, etc. I think that's it's a remarkable painting in many ways, but I shall have to do the terrible injustice of skipping over it for a minute so that I can end this talk with a few more reflections on what history painting might be, because in a way this is so untypical. 2 of the other paintings in the Salon of 1785, sort of slightly brushed aside by David's spectacular entry, include some very complex, highly skilled history paintings by rivals like Pierre, but which were made to seem by David's starkness to be almost too full of a kind of painterly rhetoric, too reminiscent of a kind of a sort of like 𝐕𝐢𝐺, slightly devoid of some of the more exciting resources. And even their subjects were burning, passionate, problematic subjects. They just seemed too elegant. And some of that studied inelegance comes back together, I think, brilliantly with a history of David's own kind of trajectory as a painter in the famous Lictors bring to Brutus the bodies of his dead son, exhibited in 1789, which as a painting contains remarkable sort of experimental shadows, as strangely as Greuze crushed Caracalla into the side of the painting, overshadowed by his strange statue. So there is the the gubernatorium and the cornucopia hanging as Fortune sort of almost crushes Brutus in this terrible dilemma where he has had to watch his sons executed and order their execution because of the plot to reinstate Tarquin power. But this is a very well-known painting too. But I just want to point out how much it uses unusual tactics. It's even less elegant in some ways, and yet it, I think, aspires in the same way as Boucher had to a kind of universalism, to a demonstration of how in charge David was of so many things, that beautiful crafting of the furniture, the the still life, which is so laden with symbolic importance, the veiled servant figure on the extreme, who counterbalances the shadowed central figure. But it is to the maternal grouping. Remember that Brutus's wife also lost many of her family who were part of the same conspiracy. It is to that figure that I wish to return just in conclusion, because of course, to me, there is also something about that figure that inevitably reminds one, but not perhaps of David's own Niobe, but of the Niobes produced, the figure of Niobe, desperately trying to shelter her female children, having watched her male children die. It's a reminiscence, perhaps an echo of David's own sort of history as a history painter. The greatest triumph, the most accomplished painting David ever painted, it reminds us of one of his greatest moments of defeat. The history of history painting is a history of defeat as much as it is a history of success, and in a way, the incorporation of the bloody dilemma of Brutus, the appalling decapitation of his own sons and the decapitated bodies coming to, is in a way reflected through David's own sort of challenge to the practice of history painter from a consistent outsider, the most insider he could have been in 1789. He had a studio, he was arch, he was really sort of king of the roost. But that sort of academic outsider is still present in this painting, which makes another part of its rather extraordinary power. Perhaps you won't agree with me, but to me, both in its monumentality and in its sort of centrality, in a way, a surprising centrality, that maternal group feels to me as if it hints back, not particularly to David's own Niobe, but to his great friend Jeanbert's Niobe. And of course, it's monumental, it's sculptural, but it also has that sort of, if you like, intertextuality or mythic intertextuality that allows a greater resonance. In the interest of actually finally finishing, I would like to make a quick point about the fact that, I've come back to David and sort of shown how failure turns into success, but actually the history of the 1780s history painting in France is more a history of those that dropped off, the Pierrons, the Ménageaux, the rivalries, the bitterness, the people left in David's wake. That's a very important part of history painting. Indeed, one might argue that from Poussin, who was never comfortable in France really, to some of the sort of lost painters of the generation of the early 1700s, to Lemoine's suicide, to Fragonard bowing out, to Greuze's catastrophic fate, to the history of French history painting is a history of échec, of failure, of not really ever getting to live comfortably with history painting, of history painting bringing the joy, comfort, success that it might have. That's perhaps a peculiar thing to say, but I would just like to end by saying that there are that David sticks out so much is actually a rather interesting testament to a kind of person who was able to write a few of his own stories, but that we have so little focused on others is perhaps testament to the fact that history painting is constantly shedding talent. It's constantly defeating talent. It constantly leads to ruination, to trouble, to disgruntlement. And that, again, I would argue that is a significant part of its history. I would also say that very few people are given to fluent and effortless grasp of it, and not even David fully. Perhaps only the great Eugène Delacroix, after Boucher, was fully at ease with the richness and complexity of what the historical genre might be. And of course, he's another story. But I thought I'd just end with this three-way comparison because it brings Niobe back into it, because it struck me that the Niobe that so tortured David was a central influence on one of the great history paintings of the 18th century, just as it was, I think, and I still believe, on one of the great and strange and most cruel history paintings of the 19th century, Delacroix's Furious Medea. But I'm afraid that is another story. Thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry I tried your patience, but I hope you will be able to listen in bits, and thus the overlong nature of this won't be too taxing. So thank you very much indeed. I look forward to a live Q&A.
Well, Mark, that was incredible. Thank you so much. I feel like you presented so much information and really, I think, exposed our visitors, our audience, to all of these great new ideas about a really complex subject.
Well, thank you. And I'm so sorry that you had to be sort of witness to my strange video presentation, and and my messy bookshelf, which is equally messy now for this Q&A. So anyhow.
We love it. Well, so now, as you know, we have time to take some questions from viewers who just watched your presentation. I'm going to start with the first one, just coming to us from Denise Ford, who asks, how much time were the students given to paint the subject for the competition in the Prix de Rome?
Well, the whole process, first from the sort of slightly pressurized moment where they were given, where they walked into where the selected few were given the subject and told to sketch something out. Once that had been approved, that sketch, they went into these, as I think David explains himself, they go into these slightly enclosed boxes, and the time did vary, but from what David says, that there was a sort of a 2-week moment there before the sculptures came into the same boxes and they had to create theirs. I think the sculptors had a little longer, and so, but it was nevertheless it was a period of intense work, which probably they were allowed. I think the actual time varied depending on which regulations they were in, but it very seldom exceeded 2 weeks.
Thank you. The next question is coming in from Amy Freund. She says, hi, Mark. Could you talk a bit more about allegory, which Philibien seems to regard as the secret sauce of history painting? How did 18th century history painters understand allegory's role?
Well, that's of course an excellent question, and one that, and hello, Amy, first of all, and thank you for listening. And it's interesting because I believe that in the first, given how prominent allegory was as a language under Lebrun and under the early Academy particularly, I think de Piles intended that allegory, the grand allegories that spread over the walls and ceilings of large decorative ensembles all through the Italian Renaissance and the Baroque, and of course in 17th century France, would remain the kind of high point. In other words, a dazzling combination of sort of erudition and ability to disguise one thing as another, to sort of lift a veil and show the veil at the same time. I think for de Piles and his generation of sort of theorists, that was going to continue. I think if you ask what then happens to it, to this special highest form of history painting, I suspect that it gets transformed, by through the intensification of painting into, let's call it painting for exhibition, easel painting, or painting that could be fit on exhibition walls. That allegory had to be either intensified or given or sort of miniaturized in some way, so that allegorical painting starts to become expressed in either in details of a painting, or in other words, when you think of how, for example, the allegorical apparatus of Fortuna or whatever is used in some history painting, it tends not to be center stage, but be sort of brought in through details, through small or sort of allusions, while a narrative swirls around it, if you like, or while and it has to sit slightly awkwardly with other forms of heightened, sometimes derived from theories of tragedy, where you will see moments of transformation or anagnorisis or whatever it is, or and I think that. But in history painting, it's a really fascinating question, because I think it's always at a tension, because it's the desperate need to paint a moment or a key moment and sort of wrap into it everything is itself a kind of, it's an alternative to an allegorical an allegorical reproduction of the qualities of something by disguising it as something else, or something that stands for a lot. So battles between metonymy and metaphor, if you like, or between different ways of doing things sort of play out. I mean, they play out in history painting, as you know. And I think that it's only at the Revolution when a sort of a new tide of allegorical, a sort of need for allegorical language, and a new tide of allegorical and symbolic representation floods back. I think that's a much wider phenomenon than on the walls of the salon and in history painting.
Thanks. Next question is coming from Jessica Fripp. She also says hello. Says, you've mentioned friendship and rivalry quite a bit. Could you speak a bit more on the impact those social dynamics had on the development of history painting at this time?
So, hello, Jessica. And as you know, I think you and I have conversed on these themes before. But I think in the talk I was trying to get at something about the fact that history painting seems unlike, if you take an autobiographical or portrait painting or something, that somehow there is a gap between the narrative we're seeing and the kind of the swirling history of interpersonal relationships that sort of that affect the painter or their public or whatever. And I think what I would argue is that there's sort of, I almost said that these are autobiographical paintings, or that they are history paintings attempt at sort of the rather naked, sometimes to the surface of history painting arises very clearly the naked tensions of interpersonal relationships and rivalries and friendships. And I think that we all know that certain of them boiled over very powerfully, so that there is some argument for saying that if the Niobe recurs in these weird shadowy ways through 𝐕𝐤𝐤, is that also not because 1771 and 2 recur in David's psyche again and again as he fulminates later on, or as he deals with 𝐕𝐤𝐫 or 𝐵𝐚𝐜𝐺, and as he writes bitchy comments to his pupils about 𝐵𝐚𝐜𝐺 in Rome and everything. I think that interpersonal relations play an enormous amount of, and I think many scholars have dwelt on that sort of from the master to pupil and all of those relationships. I think that sort of enmity and bitter rivalry among sort of companion painters probably counts for a great deal more. And I think, as you know, then one would extend this to kinship networks and the complexity of an academy that has so many people related in some way to so many other people, whether that be engravers or whether it be sort of Boucher's sons-in-law, or whether it be there's in a way we should really extend this beyond simply friendship, but to the sort of the complexities of kinship, as they and yourself and Hannah Williams and many others have been sort of trying to explore. I just wanted to argue that history painting isn't released from this, or doesn't live in a sphere above this in the way that maybe obviously portraiture indicates friendship and association and kinship. Well, it feels to me like it's never really that far from subject painting that seems to be free of these kind of sort of autobiographical or inscribed affective charges. But in fact, I seem to see it quite a lot, and maybe that's just me.
The next question is asking, you noted in Jombert's Niobe painting that the arrow is spiraling off stage. Could you speak a little further about this stage in 18th century painting? That's a loaded question.
Well, yeah, of course. It's and one designed to sort of trigger my own fascination with sort of the stage as one possible counter-modeled or inspiration for pictorial composition. I think that in a way that arrow is marking time, and actually I would give Jombert some credit for thinking that it isn't sort of just sort of badly planned, sort of rushed detail. In fact, if you look at the sketch, but one that refers to that which is beyond the scene he is able to paint. If you think about the way David decided that he needed an all-encompassing view, he needed to show the whole progression of
the whole progression of the narrative as he was trying to remember it, from the killing of the sons to the sort of weeping over that killing of the sons and then the killing of the daughters in a sequence. I think that arrow implies that one can, in one's sort of, that an artist might turn instead to ideas that, have been long developed in the theatre around sequentiality, or what one can allude to having happened or being about to happen in a different space, rather than trying to capture a sort of compress a narrative into sort of almost a sort of circularity or a long stream. I think Jean Berthaud is a different method of pointing to the sort of awfulness of the story, the inevitability that those arrows would catch up with people, that there was no escape from them, in a way that I think was rather subtle in some ways. I mean, given that these are young painters trying to invent a way of showing this terrible episode in different ways. And maybe that when I used the word stage, I was referring to the often used sort of, we know that David did it, we know that many other students, they looked to examples where a heightened sense of a narrative's accomplishment or a poignant moment might be shown. And I think that maybe Jean Bert, when I used the word stage, I was sort of thinking of the way that Jean Bert sort of realized that he had to only pursue one specific moment and could sort of hint at other things that would happen or had happened, and I think that's something from which David learns. I think that, you obviously can see that in the later history paintings, which seem to handle time and subtle uses of, aftermath, or being in the middle of a terrible, tragic series of events, but alluding to those in slightly more subtle ways than the Niobe fully accomplishes.
We have time for one final question, and it's, were French academic painters privileging particular historical narratives when selecting which episodes of Roman and Greek history or mythology to depict in their paintings?
Well, I think I've been trying to sort of say that, yes, there is a sort of, we know that there's a sort of doxology, there's a body of work which you're supposed to, as a learned painter, which might, of course, it clearly obviously included Ovid and the entire repertoire of the Metamorphoses. It included a lot of the grand epic literature. So in other words, your Virgil and your Homeric epic was something that painters were supposed to study. But what I would like to advise is, what else did they read, or which ways did they read it? Because when you look at David's notes that I showed you, I mean, the Impératrice Romaine by Servier is, I mean, it is actually just like the sex bits and the violence bits wrapped around, it's a digest that you wouldn't, I'm sure, wasn't set. So, okay, painters are like everybody else. They read, I don't know, I don't want to be absurd, but, perhaps they might not just read Virgil, or they might not just read, but they might watch Barbarians, or they might, they might take popular culture into the spectrum of the things that they want to understand as part of their armory of engaging with the subject. And I think that the more we find of these slightly peculiar readings, the more we will, the more flesh and blood we can make our understanding of how reading occurs. I mean, I was really fascinated by the fact that, even Ovid was not read in a kind of calm way by David. He's reading it in sort of almost a sort of, the blood rushing to his head. He's sort of overtaken by its more violent tales, and that, I think, is an effective engagement with sources, which isn't just about your set text and your what you should be reading. It's also how these histories, these narratives animated people's spirit, what really grabbed them. And I think there's a lot more work to be done on all of these readings among artists. And we can only find this out from sometimes when they exchange letters about things they've read, or when they've, when it's come to light that they've taken some notes on a very strange text.
Fantastic. Well, Mark, I cannot thank you enough for this incredible lecture. You've given us so much to think about and have really, brought these paintings to life and made them relevant to audiences today, which is no small feat. So I just cannot express my gratitude for your accepting the invitation to be our Rosenberg lecturer this year, and the challenge of recording a feature-length essay from your office. So we really appreciate your willingness to share your expertise with us.
Well, I would like to say to you, Nicole, and to everyone and your wonderful team, to Jesse and to JD and to Leonardo, everyone who's tried to make sure that this, trans-Pacific connection happens, and that we are able to do this. I'm so grateful, and I'm also really grateful to everyone to have listened. Sorry to have gone on a bit, and to thank you for your great attention. I can't wait to actually visit the DMA and have the great pleasure. And I'm so sorry, everybody, that you missed your wonderful 18th century night and that this is what you had to deal with instead. But I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk with you and to have answered such very interesting questions. So thank you very much.
If you'd like to revisit tonight's lecture, this link will remain active through Thursday, November 19th. So you can go back and rewatch the lecture as much as you'd like between now and then. And also please check your email in the coming days for a short survey about this virtual event. We really want to hear from you. Your feedback would be greatly appreciated. Thank you all again, and have a great evening.